So good evening, everyone. It's good to see you here on a cold, wet night. So thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Watere Maina. I'm from the School of Counselling. I am usually in Christchurch, but I am here today because I'm teaching block and I wanted to be here with you. So it's lovely to see you all. So welcome to our night, our public lecture night. And tonight we're talking about relationships, risk, and resilience. So tonight is a taster of what we do in our program for the School of Counselling. Our program is located here in Auckland and also in Christchurch. I am based in Christchurch, and tonight we have a big team, but tonight we have 4 of us who are lecturers and Jeanette as well. And so that's Lex, Lisa, and Donald. Lex, Lisa, and Donald, one of them will be speaking about relationships. The other one will be speaking about risk, and the other will be speaking about resilience. I would now like to invite Lex, who will be our first speaker. Lex is our head of school for the School of Counselling, which is here and in Christchurch as well. And he will be telling you a little more about himself as he launches into what he has to share with us. Thank you, Lex.
Evening. Nice to be here with you all. It's an interesting picture that Mary chose, isn't it, to have up there. It's probably not too far from the truth, really, about what it feels like to work at Laidlaw a bit. Really nice to have you all, some familiar faces and some new faces with us. It's also really nice to be able to open the doors a bit and make some of the conversation that we have pretty much on a daily basis here open to the wider community. One of the things I was going to tell you about was that I enjoy motorcycling, but I've just come from the airport on my motorcycle up the northwestern motorway in the rain, so I'm not sure I do enjoy it quite so much as I normally do tonight. So I've been down there teaching today. I come from Otago, a little place called Otipopo, so I like going to Christchurch. It feels like I go home a little bit when I go down there. Another thing I enjoy is working with people as a counsellor and helping people reflect on their life and live their lives more intentionally in relation to their values and hopes. In my work as a counsellor over the last 20 years, really, I've done particularly a lot of relationship counselling. One of the themes that I notice that people grapple with is isolation and loneliness, disconnection from one another. And I think it's very easy for us to blame ourselves when we feel kind of out of connection with one another. But one of the other things I notice is that there's, in our New Zealand culture, there's an assumption almost that we're individuals and that we will live life, if we're living life fully, we'll be living life as individuals, fully sort of actuated individuals. And I think that causes us a lot of problems. So one of the reasons that we do struggle so much with loneliness and isolation, I think, is some of the assumptions we have about what it means to be a person. So the tendency to see ourselves as separate, I think, causes troubles. As I thought about it, I thought there are sanctioned ways or sort of legitimised ways to be in good contact with others. If you're fortunate enough maybe to be in a couple relationship or work in a good work team, or maybe I was thinking about what it must be like to end up being a star, on whatever one of those TV programs are. I can't think of a name straight off. The World MasterChef or the World's Greatest something or other. You sort of have a moment of glory and everyone seems to know who you are at one level. So there's social reasons, I think, that we end up experiencing loneliness or disconnection. And I also think that there's personal reasons. And part of that has to do with the fear of being known and knowing one another, of getting past the superficial, I guess. So there's some of the things I think in my work I notice that keep people from connection and probably result in loneliness. So my first point really is that the individualistic view of what it means to be a person can result in significant problems. And that's not uncritiqued, is it? The social sciences, the counselling ideas, psychology ideas, ideas that we learn in teaching or all sorts of spheres would challenge that, and so would Christian theology. In fact, would challenge the individualistic idea quite robustly. And instead would propose that we're actually made for connection and interrelationship rather than separateness. So I'm actually proposing that we're persons in relation, that we know ourselves and that we thrive when we're in love relationship with one another. And that's what being fully alive actually looks like. And one of the phrases or the kind of ideas that's used around the idea of being persons in relationship is dance. The sort of to and fro-ness of me impacting you and you impacting me, and being open to that, so that we kind of get changed or we by one another, that we might risk being open enough to do that. And so that idea of being connected or interdependent or open to one another leads in a number of directions, I think, and one of them is that it leads away from isolation and towards the interdependence, and it also leads to that view that I just mentioned, the idea of becoming rather than being, which I think is a really important idea, the idea that we're not just stuck with who we find ourselves to be in our DNA when we're born, or the fate of where we are, but there's actually hope involved in being able to become and change, and that's quite dependent on our relationships, which puts relationships in a new kind of light in a way, doesn't it? Because they're not so much things that we do, but we're actually formed by them, which means how we do them matters quite a lot, I think. Cool. And so I dropped the word love in before, and I want to pick that up again. I think actually what we're talking about when we start to talk about the kind of relationship that builds us, that allows us to grow and become or flourish or experience well-being, is actually love. And so we could say the extent to which we participate in love is the extent to which we can flourish. We end up flourishing as people. And so I've got three kind of ideas, just little ideas that I thought I'd mention about what participating in love looks like. So if love isn't so much, I guess it is a feeling, isn't it? But if it's not so much a feeling as it is a relational way of being that grows us and that bestows well-being, then what does that look like? So the first thing I think it looks like is risking encounter, or daring to meet someone. And one metaphor that I find quite helpful about that, I've forgotten your name. I was looking at you, and what was that? James. I was looking at you, James, and you're looking at me when I said that. And that kind of idea of daring to encounter someone face to face or eyes to eyes rather than, or not instead of rather than actually, as well as being side by side. So I think the first point about doing love looks like risking both face-to-face connection and side-by-side connection, because we do need a balance of doing things with people as well as the intensity of hello, who are you? This is who I am. Who do you see me as? This is who I see you as. What's that like for us? I want your best. What do you need from me? That kind of face-to-face stuff. And that leads to Martin Buber's idea, which I find quite juicy, really, about the I-thou idea. What the heck does that mean? It means that what Martin Buber was a Jewish theologian that he wrote prolifically through the 50s and 60s, maybe the 40s, 50s and 60s. And he came up with this really lovely idea about love, that it's addressing one another as a subject rather than an object. So if we think about object first, the idea that if I was to relate to Lisa as an object, as my colleague, then I would think of you, Lisa, as someone who can do stuff for the school and not be so interested in who you are actually as a person. So that's sort of objectifying one another. treating one another in the way that I need to treat you to get my needs met. And Martin Buber says, no, that's not what love is. Love is when we treat one another as a subject, someone who can be addressed with a name, and I can go, instead of I'll treat you the way I need you to be, I'll treat you who you are actually, and I need to therefore be quiet or slow or gentle and say, hello, who are you? I know your name. I want to meet you who you really are. And so in a sense, being open to impact rather than closed, open to being changed by one another. And so the third kind of idea that I've got in relation to how do we do love, or actually enact love, has to do with the word embrace. I need to be open to allowing you to embrace me, and I need to embrace one another. Now, I've used that word particularly, which is by another writer that I really enjoy, Miroslav Volf, which is a Yugoslavian name. And Miroslav Volf says that we do relationships in two ways, and it's the same kind of idea as Buber's idea that I just talk about, subject or object. He said, but it's a bit more easy to get a hold of. He says, we either exclude people or we welcome them, we embrace them. And we exclude people in two ways. And I can really relate to this. That I'll relate to you if you're like me. So can we talk about the things we have in common? And if we find we haven't got things in common, then I'll shut you out. And I probably won't talk to you. I might look like I talk to you, but I'll probably spend my time with other people who are more like me. And if we look around the world, that sort of whole move seems to be going on, the sectarian kind of move. And Miroslav Volf wrote these ideas particularly out of his experience, because he's Yugoslavian in the 90s, when Yugoslavia broke up into all the Balkan states of, I can't remember the names offhand. It is Bosnia, Chechnya. Yeah, we could name them, couldn't we, out of the news almost only, if we haven't even got personal contact with hearing that going on. So there was Christians, Muslims, Catholics, Protestants, different ethnic streams. There was a lot of ethnic cleansing went on, and they ended up splitting their country up into kind of so-called safe states where we could relate to one another as we are, not have to relate to difference too much. People that aren't quite like me. So his idea is that we avoid people and therefore impoverish or take away from who we are or our potential to become who we're meant to be, i.e. thriving in relationship, interdependent. If we try and make others like me and only relate on that level, or if we exclude one another altogether if that can't happen. And he says the alternative is to love one another's or cherish one another's otherness, not to be afraid of difference, but to be open to communicating about how we find ourselves different from one another. And so that's both a stance, isn't it? Being open to that, to embrace in that sense, is a stance. I need to kind of have a sense that I'm lovable, because I guess if I don't think I'm lovable, then I may not let you close because you may not like me. So there's a bit of risk involved there, isn't there? One writer calls it the beautiful risk, the risk that really pays off, but man, it's scary. And the other one is there's action involved in loving. And just one more point I want to make from Miroslav Volf. He says, what does love look like? We assume as Christians, he says, that love will look like comfort and peace, because that's what we think it will look like in heaven. And it will, that's how things are meant to be. It's meant to be safe and comfortable. And then he says, but in the world, this side of the new creation, it actually doesn't look like that as much as we might like to think. It actually looks like risk and courage and vulnerability, where we take risks, the beautiful risk, if you like, to move towards one another. And so he defines love as working towards forgiveness, because we do hurt one another, but willing to work back towards forgiveness, working on behalf of justice, and doing that in a way that involves vulnerability, which I think is really cool. very scary and really cool. Imagine our communities if they were characterised by that style of practical love, where people were actively working towards forgiving one another, actively working on against injustice, and doing that in a way where we're vulnerable to one another. When I think about that kind of going towards one another, the parable of the lost sheep comes to mind. It's a little bit maybe like we're invited to look for one another, go searching for one another, and be willing to find one another wherever that might be. And I was thinking on a very practical level, that might look like looking for children in Nigeria or in Henderson who are at risk. Or it might look like, to use another metaphor that Carl Rogers talks about, he says that often when we communicate more on a surface level because we're more confident that that'll be okay with my hearers or the people I'm with. And he said, maybe it's like, in a sense, parts of us or some of us are locked in dungeons and we can't have much contact with the outside world, so we take a rock and we tap on the wall day after day, tapping, hoping someone will hear it and respond, and then someone does hear it and picks up a stone and taps back, and the kind of joy of the sense of being heard at a deep level. So I've just got two takeaways. Tasters and takeaways, it kind of makes sense. They don't smell like fish and chips, hopefully, but although it's not Friday, so that's all right. What are they? So I think it's really important. I'd encourage you to practice letting others know you a little bit more. And I think when we do that, we're pushing against fear and shame often. We're pushing against things that might kind of go, whoa, I don't like the feel of this. I feel a bit over vulnerable. I know after a day's teaching, I normally feel really vulnerable. And this morning at 9 o'clock, I found myself sharing something with the class, and I said, oh my goodness, I feel vulnerable already, and it's only 9 o'clock. That kind of idea of taking risks like that. So I'd encourage you to practice taking risks, and that might be about sharing things you're happy about, or sad about, or fearful about, or hopeful about. Yeah, just taking risks to connect. It's kind of, yeah. And the second takeaway, encouragement, would be practice hearing what others are saying. Practice picking up on those subterranean taps on the rock that you might hear but not even notice that you hear, or you might hear and be a bit afraid to hear them and so wish you hadn't heard them. But I'd just like to encourage you to take the risk, both in being seen and noticing others. Thank you.
Thank you, Lex. As I listened to you, Lex, a quote stood out for me, and this was when you talked about love. It said, the extent in which we participate in love is the extent to which we flourish. That really captured my attention. And then you went on and described exactly how that works out. So the next person coming up to speak to us is Lisa. And she's going to take us to the next topic, which is the topic of risk. Because when we think about fears of rejection, we need to risk in order to get into that space where we can love. So welcome, Lisa.
Hi, how you doing? I'm going to move that book. A little bit about me. I teach here at the School of Counselling, and alongside that I do a little bit of counselling stuff, and most of the counselling stuff that I have done has been working with young people and young women in particular, and in the area, most recently in the area of sexual violence, and working with people who've lived through those experiences. So that's my interest, and I love working with young people. They're kind of strange and a little bit interesting, and and a little bit hopeful too. There's lots, they come with lots of stuff, so I enjoy doing that. And I enjoy talking about this stuff too. It's fun, something to chew on. So this evening I want to talk a little bit about, the tagline for this was about managing risk and anxiety, and that's quite a big thing to do. So I'm going to walk away from that a little bit, but I might approach it a little bit differently. And I want to approach it by exploring how we might support ourselves and others in the face of adversity, in the face of the hard stuff. And I think most importantly, what meaning we make of who we are in the middle of this hard stuff. Who do we understand ourselves to be? And I've struggled, as I've written this, I've struggled trying to figure out the right words to use this evening, because there's, adversity or bad stuff or unexpected life events or stress or trauma. We have all these words that we use to talk about stuff that happens that sucks, basically, in our life. And I think also the word we use sort of implies the degree of seriousness. If we use a big word like trauma, or we use a little word like bad stuff, we pick our words according to degrees. But I want to talk about this stuff tonight, this way of looking at these things tonight, because I think it's a one-size-fits-all approach. We can kind of apply it to any of this range from bad stuff to trauma. It's a way of looking at these things. And I want us to reflect on some practices or understandings which might support us as we journey, and hopefully as I talk we might see how some of these might connect with what Lex has been talking about and what Donald's going to talk about later on. Hopefully you can make the connections. Ask me at the end if you can't, and I'll try and make them. So sometimes the bigness of life events can swallow us up, and can swallow up our sense of power or our sense of agency in our lives, our sense of being able to do anything in the face of what's happening to us. And it's really easy to get lost in that story of difficulty. Well, I think it is. You might have a different story to tell, but I think that sometimes happens. And I think it's whether it's our story, or if it's a story of a loved one that we're hearing, or a story of that we're hearing in the work that we're doing. And this is an experience of many of our counsellors as they start doing this stuff, is oh my goodness, I'm hearing these big stories, and how do I hold these stories and do this work? So often the spotlight gets kind of put on the story, whatever kind of story it is, risk or danger or illness or loss or conflict or worry, and the focus is on the details of the story. And in the telling and retelling of a story, sometimes we get lost in the middle of that. It becomes the story and not about ourselves. So I want to use some of the ideas of a dude called Michael White, and he's someone who kind of developed some ideas around narrative therapy. It's kind of a way of doing counselling stuff, basically. And a guy called Alan Wade, and he's a family therapist in Canada, and a lady called Vicky Reynolds, who's also in Canada and works, she calls herself a survivor/activist, and I kind of want to know what that means a little bit more, but... So we're going to talk about some of the ideas that these people have written and spoken about. And they'll invite us to look at these life events a little bit differently. And I think these ideas position us in a stronger place to walk through them, or sit in them, or whatever we do in the middle of them, drown in them, or fight them, or whatever we're doing. So I'm going to start by thinking about how I respond to life difficulties. And so I want to invite you to start thinking about the different ways in which you respond to life's difficulties. Alan Wade talks about responses rather than effects. He argues that if we talk about the effects of a problem on a victim, it implies sort of a submission or an action to it, that these things are being done to us. If we speak about a person's response to a problem or an event, we're invited to start viewing someone as more active, someone who can do something, someone with more agency. In this, we're wanting to step away from an idea of that there's good responses or bad responses, because we could pull that apart till the cows come home. But I think there is some merit in thinking about healthy and less healthy ways of doing things. but we want to focus on responses. So I might ask myself, what responses do I have? What do I think about something that's happening to me? What do I feel about it? What do I say about it? What do I do about it? What are my responses to this life event that has happened to me? These can be the most invisible of activities or the most explicit. At its most simplest place, I recognise that even me just thinking, this sucks, is a response, a declaration, a position that I've taken up. This bites, I don't like this. I'm responding to what's happening to me. Even in the face of circumstances in which we feel totally powerless, we will be responding in some way. So Michael White and Alan Wade and others have written about our response to hardship and pain as being resistance. And that even in the smallest responses, there is resistance to the unfairness or the painfulness or the not okayness of what has happened. Even in the face of the most difficult circumstances, where we feel the most powerless, we are protesting. I like that word, it's so strong, makes me want to write a placard. We are expressing non-compliance. We're going, this is not okay. So in my work with young women who've experienced sexual assault, it was significant for us to notice even the smallest things that they had done to resist what was happening to them. Even in their thinking, stop, I don't like this, this is not good, this is not okay. Even in the thinking of that, or in the way they might have tensed their body up, or in the smallest of things, resisted and protested what was happening to them. So when I meet someone as a counsellor, I hold an understanding that I'm talking with someone who already knows something about how and they're doing some things to resist and protest the things that are happening to them. So I reckon toddlers are the most skilled at this level of resistance. That's what I think. The tantrum is a beautiful example of resistance and protest. In the face of powerlessness, the least one can do is screw up their face and scream. And I like the idea of the tantrum. It's annoying when it's your child tantruming in the middle of a supermarket, but there's something powerful in that. So as I've started talking, where has your mind travelled to? If you're anything like me, when things like this start being talked about, my mind jumps to the biggest life event that's ever happened to me. And I'm really mindful that I don't want to invite those stories into this conversation tonight if you don't want them to be here. You're trying to enjoy a nice night out, you might not want these things to be in your head. So if you've started to think about some moments of resistance, maybe think of things that aren't the biggest things. Are there some littler things that you might hold in your head that we can think about? But as you've started thinking about these, have you noticed some responses? Have you noticed some moments of resistance? What you did or felt or said or thought, which expressed an unwillingness to experience what was happening in the moment. Can you think of those moments of resistance? When you think about these responses, what is it like to think about it as resistance? So I've been trying to think of like a lived example to kind of ground this a little bit. And of course, my head went to the biggest things that life has ever thrown at me. But I think I've managed to find a medium-sized one for us to chew on a little bit. So a little while ago, my house got burgled. Not a lot of fun. Came home, and there it was, the stuff was everywhere, the doors were open, and well, the stuff wasn't all everywhere, some of the stuff wasn't there. And so I thought about the responses. What were my responses to this? Well, there were tears, there was crying, there was anger, a fair amount of that. There was hypervigilance, and that word kind of means like you're really alert, like you jump at everything, or you're super aware of what's going on. It's a flash word for that, really. There was some impatience. I wanted this sorted. I wanted my stuff back. I didn't want to fill out forms and talk to people. I wanted it sorted. There was a sense of loss. I'd lost stuff. There was a bit of fear about what had happened and what that might mean, and there was a little bit of anxiety. These were my responses. And I started thinking about them as resistance. What did they mean? So when we've recognised the responses and we've considered them as resistance, and we're invited to think about what are we resisting, And what is on the other side of that? What is important to me that I'm standing up for? What is the resistance saying about what I value? So if we notice the things that cause us pain or sadness or worry, we might then be able to notice what is important to us, what we're valuing. So what's the distress or the worry or the stress of life? What's it telling you about what's important to you? What are your responses telling you about what you're valuing? So back to the burglary. Let's go back to me. The tears came when my son started crying. It's always the way. And because his laptop had been stolen. I'm glad they stole it. It was half broken. It was the best thing they took. That and the broken camera. But he was devastated. The tears told me that I cared for my son and I cared about him being okay. So that's what the tears told me. The hypervigilance told me that safety was important. I valued safety and the need for me to feel like I could protect myself and my child. That's what the hypervigilance told me. The sense of loss told me that I valued my stuff. Yeah, it was just stuff, but it wasn't just my stuff that I valued. I valued the time and the effort that had gone into acquiring that stuff. I valued the story behind how that stuff happened to be in my house, that I had worked hard for that stuff. If something hurts, then something is important to me. I think this can invite a richer knowing of myself and ourselves when we're in the middle of this painful thing, that I can hold on to the fact that I know what I value, I know what's important to me. And it strengthens my sense of who I am, and it resists the pain's attempt to kind of erode this knowledge about myself. So in this experience of the burglary, there are now some things I know more about myself. I know I value my family. Well, I kind of knew that anyway, but this was a different level of that. I value their happiness and their safety to the point where I might actually act with force to protect that. You know, I was angry. I was going to do something if anyone tried to get in my house again. I valued hard work and a sense of achievement, the recognition that I'd worked for something. And so in noticing and acknowledging these things about myself, I'm able to see what it is that's important to me. And the story of the burglary becomes less about the burglary and a little bit more about what I stand for in life. So Vicky Reynolds says that which is causing despair directs us towards that which we are hoping for. I really like that idea that we can then, in the middle of the stuff, see what's important to us. So I keep coming back to the tantrum. And in my head, I see myself as the toddler, because that's fun. Ever had a little tantrum inside? It's good, it's cathartic. Even in the middle of feeling this sense of powerlessness and screaming, this isn't okay, I want something else. There's something which is disruptive in doing that, that's powerful, is saying, no, this sucks. So sometimes, in these difficult life events, these things are an expression of a larger social injustice. So we might experience this on many different levels, in our own lives or in the lives of the people around us. And these are the things I kind of talk about with the counselling students when they bring their stories and they're noticing these injustices that their clients are kind of encountering with. And so we talk about how we take care of ourselves as we do this work and hear these stories of hardship. And Vicky Reynolds again offers some practices which kind of stand as resistance to the injustice experienced and heard in these stories. And it's not unusual to think about life experiences and feel like a sense of injustice, a sense of this isn't okay, it's not just kind of an accidental thing, it's an unjust thing that happened. And so while she writes this directed at counsellors who are doing this work, I think there's something in these ideas which can kind of support us in the everyday living of our lives to engage with these ideas on behalf of resistance and protest. So recognising that that resistance may be on behalf of justice doing, that we're protesting against oppression rather than adjusting to it, that by resisting it we're not kind of submitting and changing and bowing down to it, that even in the smallest ways we're going, nah, this sucks, I don't like it. Reynolds talks about a number of different practices which centre around relationship, developing solidarity with others based on shared ethics, a shared commitment to ways of living, drawing on each other for support and acknowledging the transformative power of relationships. Drawing people around you that share the same sense of ethics and justice and working for justice. I wonder what communities that we're a part of that might reflect this solidarity of shared ethics. Our church communities, our friendships, our families. How are we engaging with others and supporting others in the face of injustice? And this isn't intended to sound like an invitation to activism in the classical sense. I'm not asking you to march anywhere, but it's about being intentional in the everyday living of our lives to support ourselves and each other on behalf of justice. Resistance on behalf of justice is recognising that we're participating in a revolutionary love. I wonder how our theology might join with this idea. It's such a powerful concept, revolutionary love. A love that invites community and solidarity and can be expressed even in the most difficult of circumstances. When people are faced with events they have little or no control over, I think strength can be found in noticing what we're doing, no matter how small, to resist the power of this difficulty. And what that says about us, what's important to us and what we're valuing, and what we are doing to protect what's important to us. And I wonder if when we understand our responses as resistance, then that is what we're facing can seem a little bit less powerful, that what we're sitting in the middle of or dealing with just has a little bit less of an edge to it, and we might experience ourselves as stronger in living through it. So tonight, what responses have you recognised in yourself as you've thought about some of these things? Have you been able to make some connections with what you were claiming as important to you in those responses? Have you thought about some of those things that you might be valuing? What has it been like to notice this is important? What's it been like to go, oh, I might find this important as something you value? When thinking about responses as resistance, do you have some idea about what it is that you're resisting? And is there a story of justice seeking or justice doing in this resistance? I'd invite you to spend a little bit of time, rather than thinking about the effects of what life is throwing at us, to think about our responses to them and how we might explore those a little bit and think about what they represent as important to us. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Think about responses rather than effects. That really stood out for me. And then I wrote, when something hurts, something is important to me. Helps me know what I value, strengthens me in knowing what is important for me and what I stand for. Now, Donald is coming next, and he will be speaking to us about resilience. So welcome, Donald.
2 days ago, my daughter Jessie had her first daughter, Jessie. So my house, I come here this evening from my house, which has just got these beautiful sounds of, is it mewling? Is that the right word? And I can say things like, milk coming in and latching on. Not quite sure what that means, but apparently it's a success story. I want to, actually it's just lovely to be standing here. I like this position. Better get my bits of paper out. I want to draw you a picture of a tree. My first degree was horticulture. In fact, my very first degree was landscape gardening. Led me straight to counselling, of course, as you can imagine. You've probably worked out by now that trees grow in the ground. Yeah? And they have roots, right? If this was a class, I'd be asking you to draw this with me. Just have a little think about that as we go. They got trunks, haven't they? And they have roots that come down, and then the trunks come up and there's branches, is that right? In your trees? They have branches coming up off them like this, branches. It's not a very flash tree. And then I know it's a stink tree, isn't it? It's a stink drawing, yeah. And then they have leaves on them. I'm not sure what sort of a tree that is, but I'm searching for another colour now. And you may have noticed in trees in your gardens perhaps that they have sometimes flowers and stuff. It's like a flower. And sometimes they have fruit. What sort of tree is that, by the way? A fruit tree. If this was a counselling class, let's just pretend for a tiny second that it is. If this was a counselling class, we might think about how we could use this tree as part of our counselling work. And I'd be saying to you something like, a tree like this can be very helpful in conversations with some people. Let's take, for instance, people whose lives have been separated from the important people in their lives. I originally encountered this work out of both Rwanda and Nigeria. Death by violence, death by AIDS, and children being separated from their families. Yeah. I came to it at Waitakere College, working with young people from Afghanistan who'd been separated by war from their homes and had found themselves deposited in New Zealand. Another young boy I was working with who came from the Thai Lao community and found himself in New Zealand. One of the skills that he had, it was shooting birds for dinner. Now, there weren't a lot of people who understood that in fourth form at Waitakere College. It's not a common skill, right? So that's one of the reasons why we might use this tree, one of the conversations we might use this tree, or we might use it to help people have conversations to tell their life more fully. You're going to see why in a moment. But the more fully we tell our lives, and the more fully the way we tell our lives are connected to other people, the more richly we experience ourselves. If my life is isolated, disconnected from the people from whom I came, then my life is thin in some way. And the more it's connected back to the people from whom I come, the richer my life is. And that's what this assists us to help people have that conversation. So, we're not going to do this, but if it was a class you would be doing this, I'd make you do this. Let's just imagine for a moment what the different parts of this tree might help us do. So, where do you come from? Culturally, country-wise, faith-wise, where do you come from? If we began to talk about where you came from, I wonder what stories would emerge from us. What's your language or the languages that you're familiar with? Just by the way, I put some notes to this on your chair. So by all means, write down notes as much as you like, but I actually wrote them for you. What sort of languages do you have? Can you see how rich that might be for some people? Who taught you the most in life? Who are the people who taught you when you were young to be the person that you are now? These are lovely questions to help people reconnect with where it is that they came from. By the way, do you have favourite songs? Are there favourite dances? Can you tell me some stories from your life about singing and dancing? Where would that question take you? Have you been part of teams? Have you been part of clubs? Those sorts of inquiries help people to get at the roots of their life, something about where it is that they came from. There's lots more, but can you get the idea of what that might be doing for us? And then roots are in soil. And in this little diagram, the soil asks you to speak with people about the things that they do in their day. So what sort of things do you do in your life, in your day? Now, we could have that conversation in the here and now. How do you spend your life today? Or we could have that conversation back in the day. That boy from the Thai Lao border, the conversation that he and I had about hunting for birds came, what sort of things did you used to do? What sort of things kept you busy? when you lived there. And he was able to recall some of those stories for me. So that's a second conversation that this tree allows us, or this diagram allows us to have. Now, it seems to me that when you talk about the things that people do, implicit within them are skills. Yes? There are skills in shooting birds, whatever. There are skills. So let's take those skills and put them in the trunk and start to name some of that stuff. By the way, who's doing this picture? Who's doing the writing? Not me. The person I'm in conversation with. Yes? And my friend who taught me this stuff, who did this work in Nigeria, of course she was doing it in the context of an orphanage. And there were lots of kids all doing it at once as a kind of a collective activity. And we'll see the value of that in just a moment. So, skills, abilities. And again, this important question here, which we're going to repeat again and again, who taught you that? If there are skills and abilities which come out of this, the things you do, how does that connect with the people in your life? Who taught you that kind of stuff? Let's move up now. If we were to look at some of the branches coming up into here, let's have a look. What are some of the dreams that you have for life? What are some of the hopes that you have for life? Where do you see yourself going? What are you longing for? Depending on the people that you're having this conversation with, that will or will not go somewhere. I find 14-year-old boys don't take that very far. But other people do. It depends. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. Now, in the leaves, I might ask the person to begin to write on their leaves, who are some of the significant people from your life? Again, that question. Who are some of the significant people in your life? When I think about that, I think about this guy called Larry Harper. I could tell you the whole story about this, but I won't. But Larry Harper met me when I was 21 and wasn't all that sensible. And he taught me to love plants. And because Larry taught me to love plants, I went on to be a horticulturalist. And plants have been such an important part of my life. And he's a significant person in my life. He's contributed. How many people are there in your life that have spoken into your life? Or if you're having this conversation with somebody, who are the significant people in their life? Now let's look for a moment at the flowers and the seeds and the leaves. If you're working with somebody who's younger, you could use these, so the flowers and the fruits and so on, to be what are the gifts that people have given you in life? Gifts given. But if you're working with somebody who's a bit older, you might begin to ask, what are the things that you are wanting to leave in life? What are the things, what's your legacy? What are you leaving forward in life? What would you hope, what difference would you hope to make for others in life? Yeah? You can see that story, right? Now there's two more parts that I'd like to show to you about this before I move on to just one other small thing. The first one is this. Having drawn out that conversation, then you might invite the person to start, or the people that you're working with, to start making connections. See, these skills, who taught you that stuff? And these significant people, what can we add to the trunk from them? And so we can start to thicken this stuff up, add more stuff back into it. So the picture gets richer and richer as we go along. Secondly, you might include a compost bin. I don't know about you, but some of the stuff that's come up in my life which is nourishing and good didn't look that good when it went in. I don't know, I've had a couple of pretty significant kind of run-ins with depression in my life, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But my goodness, it's been helpful. In some relationships that we've been in, some of them produce fruit that weren't good at the time, but have come to be something. So a compost bin's a nice place to put those things. because bad things can, unwanted things can sometimes produce good fruit. Okay, that was a tiny window into a lecture in Year 2 Laidlaw Counselling program, just a weeny piece of it. Let's just do a tiny piece of philosophy of that, or theory of that. No, I need to tell you one more thing before I go there. You could take that a fraction further. What if there were storms in life? How do storms happen? What are storms like? We could have that conversation, couldn't we? If there were birds in this tree and animals living in this tree, how would they protect themselves in that way? Which then might lead us to a conversation about how do you protect yourself when storms come into your life? And what sort of storms have come into your life? Kapai? You get that idea? And then this stuff here is used to tell other people this new story about me. Imagine if you were working with people who were from an orphanage, who were disconnected from their family background. Their identity beforehand, before doing this, is I am an orphan. Can you just imagine for a moment, what is the difference between I am an orphan and that story? It might be pretty significant. And if we start sharing that story with others, if those Afghani kids that I work with at Waitakere College then start sharing that with their teachers start to see them as something more than these kids who don't talk English all that well. They see a whole bunch of other stuff about them. A new reality becomes available for them. The theory is simply this. Identity is a social achievement. Who we are is a product of the relationships that we're in. The more richly we story the relationships we're in, the more robust our identity. The more we, I guess, enjoy ourselves, really. The more nourishing and nurturing our sense of self is. I just wanted to show you that tonight. Hope that was okay.
Thank you, Donald. Tree of life. I think what stands out for me is just how we can use creativity to allow a person to discover who they are in a relationship. We are formed in relationships. I think that has really stood out for me today. And as I listen about how you can help another re-author their story through relationship in a creative way like this, I think it's amazing. So I'd like to now invite Lex to come and talk a little bit about our School of Counselling and to just share a little bit more.
Yeah, we just thought it'd be good to talk a little bit about some practical stuff to do with the counselling school. For those of you that might be interested in doing some study with us. I was aware Hillary's here. There's a number of you. There's some of you here already study with us. Some have studied with us. Got one of our auspicious graduates sitting here, and it's Hillary. There's three ways to access the counselling school, really, on two sites. Same offerings in Christchurch and Auckland. Same lecturers in Christchurch and Auckland. We run a really creative way of delivery. So I teach my courses here and in Christchurch, and the Christchurch lecturers teach their courses in Christchurch and up here, which is really cool from a community perspective. And so the bachelor's program is a 3-year Bachelor of Counselling, and that's designed to train professional counsellors. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And starting from next July, which isn't very far away, is it? Sort of like 7 weeks away. We're also offering the first year of the Bachelor of Counselling as a standalone diploma. We've continually get asked for if people can come and do part of the program for a whole variety of reasons to support what they're already doing, but they're not necessarily wanting to head towards professional counselling. And so we've continually been frustrated that we haven't been able to offer that, but we can now. So Laidlaw has been offering the first year of the Bachelor of Theology as a one-year diploma, and now we're able to offer the first year of the Bachelor of Counselling as a one-year diploma. So we've got, it's slightly confusing, they're both called Diplomas of Christian Studies, but the one in the theology school majors on biblical studies and theology, and the one in the counselling school majors on relational care, the kind of stuff we've been talking about tonight. And if we thought about a funnel, I think the whole Bachelor of Counselling narrows its focus quite specifically into one-to-one and couple counselling, one-to-one counselling specifically. And the first year, though, there isn't any practice involved in it. There's no one-to-one counselling practice. It's formation. So a big emphasis on getting to know ourselves, a big emphasis on listening skills, on relational encounter skills, and some of the theories that go around that. And there's groups that run through that year, groups of 5 or 6 with 2 leaders, where we get to know how to relate to one another well, how you experience me, how I experience you. They're kind of conversations we'd like to have, but we never really have the confidence to have about relational, how we are in relationship, really. And so that might be useful, that diploma, for people who are involved in youth work or heading towards chaplaincy, or simply find yourselves in situations where you're wanting to connect with people and listen more effectively. I know a lot of people that come and apply for our counselling program, the whole bachelor's degree, will say, why are you here? And they'll go, we continually get into conversations and we don't know where to take them from here. You know, kind of people will start talking to me and I start going, I don't know how to respond to that effectively. I think that first year is a really good, entree or foundation for that. And then the third, so that's the first way to access the program is through the first year. And people that are going to go right on and do the bachelor's degree will do that as well. And you can stop at the end of the first year with a diploma of Christian Studies. And the other place is, if you've already got a diploma of counselling, you can come and upgrade that with us, bridge across to the degree by doing another year at the top, basically the third year of our degree.